Hi there, I'm David Benitez, and this is Extreme Vocal Institute. And this week I'm going to be talking with you all about how to get the most out of your vocals in the studio. Now, you may have noticed that we didn't put out another video last week, and that's because I myself was in the recording studio working on some new music ideas all of last week. And while we didn't have time to film anything this time around, what I thought about was all of the different work that went into everything in the time before getting there, what was done in the time in the studio, and how recovery was done after the fact. And I wanted to talk with you guys about this week because I see lots and lots of questions about this floating around online, and I'm asked about this often in one-on-one lessons, where many different people don't necessarily know ahead of time how to properly prepare for the work that's going to be done in the studio and how to handle themselves while they're there, especially when it's someone's first time working on something or potentially recording for the longest release they've done so far. The difference between doing a short band practice versus tracking for a whole day is very different. And the type of practice that you want to be putting into play as you're preparing is going to be much different. Just like preparing for a marathon, it's different than just working out every day or running every day to try and make sure your body's ready. You're getting yourself ramped up for one period of time where you're vocalizing for much longer than normal. And because of this, it's important to take different steps as you get ready to advance to that point and then cycle back down. I'll be talking about a lot of different perspectives in terms of this topic today, but the first thing I want you all to keep in mind is there's never just one way to do something. Everybody has different rituals when it comes to the studio or recording their own music for that matter, and everybody has things that work for them. Everybody's bodies are different, everybody's voices are different, and we all come at this from different perspectives and from different places. That being said, this is more or less what I recommend, and what I know at least works from my perspective, and what I see in terms of general overall health benefits of the voice and the body and the mind, what will help you to be able to unlock everything you need and have the endurance and stamina to be able to power through and sound your best during your time in the studio and make the most out of that time. Now, where this starts is different things lifestyle habit-wise. Practicing different things in terms of wellness is where you want to start first. Depending on how long you think you'll be tracking for, you can gauge this based on if you're recording one song or a couple of songs, or maybe you're scheduled either with your own band or actually with an actual studio and a producer to record a whole album. In that instance, you can assume you're going to be recording for much longer. So depending on that, you want to start this prep work a couple of weeks out if it's going to be longer, or less if it's going to be shorter. Now, let's say you're recording an album. Let's say you're recording a collection of songs. You want to start the preparation at least 2 or so weeks before you get into the studio to start changing the rhythm of your body leading up to things. We're trying to create consistency for ourselves in as many ways as possible, so that in the moment, when we really need our bodies to work with us, it's going to be the most willing to comply. Versus if things are a little tight or a little tense and you didn't do enough prep work, there are many instances where things will kind of fight you a little bit, especially as you enter hour maybe 3 or 4 of vocal recording in the studio, you might feel things starting to give out a little bit. So preparing in these ways is going to help you to keep that endurance up and make it so your body can handle what's going on. Now, like I mentioned, consistency. We're talking sleep, we're talking diet, we're talking little bits of exercise, and we're talking about just trying to create as much of this consistency as possible because this is how the body operates. This is how we keep things at their healthiest, their happiest, and their strongest. The body wants to be in this kind of rhythm at all times and hates change. That being said, just no prep work at all and diving right into a studio session is pretty much a surefire way to kind of hit things wrong or not sound exactly the way you want to, and potentially hurt yourself as well. Because jumping from one state to another will end up being more negative for you than positive because of the body being more likely to fight you than work with you. So changing those consistencies slowly over a period of time can essentially trick the body into working with you and being ready for this level of work by the time you get to the studio, so it's not behaving like anything's changed at all. Now, with consistent sleep, this is infinitely more important than just sleeping a lot. This is because the more of a rhythm you can develop with your sleep cycle, the more healing will be done. When we're vocalizing or doing any kind of work, we are creating muscular and tissue breakdown. And when that heals up from us breaking the tissue down, that's what then builds us up to be stronger, both physically and vocally. They're the same thing. They're all you. Now, most cellular regeneration is done in our sleep. So the more consistent and the more healthy our sleep is, the better the healing will be, and we'll be able to get back on our feet faster from the vocal work we've done. Say you're recording vocals multiple days in a row because you're working on a longer release, and you only have X amount of time to get the work done. You don't always have time to take several days off before getting back in the booth and continuing to do what you were doing. So it's very important to optimize how quickly your body can recover from things, because no matter how careful we are and how good our form is, nothing's perfect, and the idea isn't to be perfect. So little things will go wrong here and there, and you'll still feel a bit tired, because it's not like when you're doing it right, you're just doing nothing. So recovery is important, and keeping on top of a consistent sleep schedule in the weeks leading up to you working on things will only benefit you for this reason. On top of that, you want to make sure you have enough energy built up for your time in the studio. It's different than just being at band practice. It's different than just playing shows. You're vocalizing for much longer, and even though you aren't running around and you're more so just standing there in front of the microphone, you are burning through a lot of energy while doing this, without noticing it, without seeing it either, because there's a lot going on behind the scenes making the sounds that we're doing here possible, as we talk about in all of our videos here in this channel. So making sure you can boost energy is important, and one way to do that is creating a consistent, moderate exercise schedule for yourself, again in those weeks. If you're someone that doesn't get much exercise during the week regularly, that's okay. You don't have to push yourself beyond your limits. Just make sure you are getting your heart rate up here and there, making sure you're getting your body nice and mobile, moving around, using some energy every day. Doing that consistently so that by the time you get into the studio, it's not exhausting within the first hour. You want to make sure you build up your endurance to be able to get yourself ready for whatever amount of time you're going to be vocalizing for, and how many days in a row you're going to be doing that same work. So prepare your body in these ways as well. On top of that, we need to replenish that energy as we're burning through it, and the best way to do so is to eat a little cleaner than you might normally. That might mean a little bit more fruit and vegetable-wise, a bit more salad than you may be used to. I know that's definitely the case for me. But it really helps in terms of just keeping the upper respiratory system, the vocal tract, everything nice and energized and nice and clean. There is such a thing as vocal hygiene. And one thing you can do for this, on top of steaming to keep different things allergen-wise and everything else out of your system, is to make sure you're eating cleaner around the times where you're doing the most vocal work, to make sure that everything responds appropriately when the brain gives the commands to go through the actions that we do when vocalizing. If all you do is eat cheeseburgers for 2 weeks before going into the studio, it's not that you'll sound terrible, but you'll notice that very slight delay between the brain giving the command and something actually happening. And that's enough for things to go wrong. That's enough for everything to be kind of gunked up and slow and kind of worn out a little bit and not energized, for everything to get tired faster and for you to hit that weird wrong note sooner. And that might put you out of commission for the rest of the day. And depending on your situation with your recording, you might not be able to afford to not be able to keep tracking or keep working. You might be on a very tight schedule or an even tighter budget. So utilizing the time you have is incredibly important, and one way to make sure you don't hit that point is to keep on top of things from a dietary standpoint leading up to this. Now, with that being said, you also want to practice moderation with different things. The biggest one being alcohol. Now, this is also different for everybody because different substances affect people in different ways. I know for myself that most types of alcohol will dry out my own throat pretty much instantly. Granted, I'm definitely pretty sensitive with the dehydration factor of things from working on this so much, but other people don't necessarily get that dried out. This is different for everyone, but general rule of thumb, from a scientific standpoint, you want to kind of stay away from alcohol in the weeks before tracking, and especially during, because you want to make sure everything is nice and hydrated. So again, everything's working with you and is fluid, and all the cells involved in all this work are nice and full and functional. Now, that doesn't mean just totally abstain from everything and be super strict. You can still live your life, just be mindful of what it is you're doing and how that may affect you. So maybe cut back a little bit, have a little less of things on some days, maybe just time it differently as well. Just make sure it's something you're thinking about in terms of all of these different lifestyle things, and change up your balance a little bit to start to build yourself and ramp yourself up to where we're going to be physically by the time we're in the studio. And that being said, we also need to think about our voices. We need to actually train ourselves differently than we normally would in the time leading up to this. In the example of something like a marathon or any kind of physical competition that's more strength-based, per se, one thing that is very common in terms of misconception, say, let's use bodybuilding as an example. People that take part in those kinds of sports don't look like that year-round. Being in that kind of physical state is not healthy and not sustainable. Just like marathon runners, people aren't running miles and miles and miles and miles like that every single day because that's not sustainable. The human body isn't able to take on that kind of work all the time. So what we're going to do is prepare ourselves to be able to do that kind of work for the very short period of time that we need to do it. And then just like an athlete, cycle down kind of into what you can call an off season. So we need to change what we're doing on a day-to-day basis to make sure that we're ready. Now, you should be, but in the event that you're not someone that practices on a regular basis, this is where you really want to create a consistent schedule for yourself, because what we're building up to is vocalizing day after day after day. And you can't just do that from no practice and nothing. So there needs to be some sort of prep work vocally. Let's give the example again of 2 weeks. You're doing an album, we're prepping for 2 weeks beforehand. For the first week, the first half of your prep period, work a little more on stability and some range expansion, both melodically and with your screaming tones if that's what you're working on. In the beginning, you want to make sure everything is just functional and totally relaxed and balanced. You want to make sure the way you're making these different sounds is not being rooted in strain. And especially if you're coming off of a longer break vocally, even though you may know what you're doing and you may have been doing it for a while, things are going to be a bit sticky, a bit slow to respond. So we need to wake everything up and reignite all of the fires that get the engine going to make sure that we're actually creating and producing sounds in the most optimal way possible energy-wise, so that we're not burning out after 20 minutes. Start with maybe a half an hour of vocal practice. Start small and every day kind of build it up by 10 or so minutes, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, working on endurance with the amount of time you're doing things for as well, in addition to stability and expanding your range. Range things being important because when you're entering the studio, this is where you need to be the most flexible, because even if you're only using kind of one tone of voice, because there are plenty of different artists and different styles of music where everything kind of sits in a similar sonic wheelhouse with itself, that's okay and that's totally fine, and art is whatever you make of it. But when you're recording, you probably want to be able to have a little bit of wiggle room within what it is you're doing. And in order to properly attain that, you need to actually work on flexibility with your melodic range as well. Because as I always say, all screams are pitch-based. Therefore, what you're capable of doing is going to be entirely dependent on what's going on melodically. Now, again, as I've covered in many videos here on our channel, you can manipulate sound further beyond just what the start pitch is, but if you're also working on your melodic range and keeping things stable there as well, that will only help you in the moment because you'll be able to get the sounds you're going for with the minimal amount of effort behind it, which is going to increase the amount of time you can go for. Again, consistency and endurance is key when it comes to being in the studio. Now we've entered week 2. Let's say now we're going to work on different things in terms of tone and delivery. This is where you're going to start to want to work even more on expanding your sound and maybe some more of the intensity, the ferocity behind it. Now we're going to get into what you actually want to sound like in the moment when you're tracking. It's a bit different than just playing a show because what you really need is that one take, that one golden take that's going to really sit right with the music and communicate what it is you're going for. So you can go a little crazy. You can go a little out there with what it is you're doing, but you want to make sure you develop what you're going for ahead of time so that by the time you get to the studio and you do it, it doesn't knock you on your feet for the rest of the day. Now, the delivery as well, especially if you're doing something a bit busier, a bit wordier. A lot of what we do metal-wise tends to be kind of on the quicker side. You want to develop the endurance to be able to get through longer takes, longer phrases, so you're not having to punch in and out every few words without getting exhausted. So that's kind of how you want to shift the focus as you enter the second week of your preparation work, or at least that's what I find kind of works best. Now, as you're doing this through these 2 weeks, another thing I suggest is implementing and sprinkling in days of no vocal work at all. And these days are almost more important than the days where you're actually working on yourself. 2 days on, 1 day off. You're vocalizing 2 days in a row, you're working on all these intense things, and then you have a day of doing nothing. Then another 2 days of work, then a day of nothing. Back and forth, leading up to when you're in the studio itself. This is optimizing that rest time, and it's cycling it in every couple days to make sure the work you're doing is really being ingrained into your system. So by the end of those 2 weeks, from a vocal standpoint, comparatively, you can essentially do backflips, and you're not going to be worried at all about being able to keep energy up or worry about the quality of your takes when you're in the studio, because you will have done the work ahead of time to be comfortable enough with yourself to get into the studio, into the booth, put the headphones on, get up to the mic, take a deep breath, and know what it is you're going to get, rather than feeling like you have to cross your fingers and kind of hope for the best and just not know what's going to happen. This puts you in control. This puts your hand on the steering wheel, as it were. So now you guys know what I do in preparation leading up to the studio. Tune in next week here on our YouTube channel to see what I do both during and after the fact in terms of recovery. If you want more information on these topics, I cover this in private lessons and more in our EVI Now online guided lesson program. If this video is helpful for you, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And again, make sure you tune in next week for part 2 of this video. We'll see you next time, and scream responsibly.